What's up, everyone? I love podcasts and I love sharing them. And I recently got into a lot of business podcasts, being the MBA student that I am. So today, my top 5 business podcasts. Let's do it. What's going on, guys? So today we will be discussing the top 5 business-related podcasts. A bit about myself. My name is Prerak Juthani. I am an MD-MBA candidate at the Yale School of Medicine and Yale School of Management. I love making videos about productivity, medicine, and business. Here are some of my interests, and I'm linking a lot of the stuff that I've worked on in the past below, but in the chance that you want to check it out, it'll be right there. So the agenda for today is I'm going to actually discuss all 5 interesting podcasts that I like listening to from a business perspective, and also link a few of the episodes of each podcast that I like. And I'm, of course, going to link this presentation in the description below so you can see all of the episodes that I find interesting, as well as maybe even give a listen to the podcast if you're interested. So with that being said, let's start with number 5, which is actually startup. So I love entrepreneurship. One of the reasons I made this YouTube channel is because of that. And this podcast is the go-to for anyone who's getting interested or loves looking into starting entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is such a vague subject. It's very difficult to know how to make something from the ground up and all that it takes to make that happen. And so this podcast is quite literally about the company called Gimlet, which was recently acquired by Spotify, but it was a company that was dedicated to making podcasts. And this podcast startup is about Gimlet itself and how they were able to start Gimlet. And it's actually a really great way for someone to get an insight into what does it take to get a venture off of the ground. And it is so good. I think the first season was about Gimlet, and shortly after, other seasons are about other entrepreneurs and how they take a product from start to finish. But I personally just really enjoyed listening to that first season because it really puts into perspective just how much work is needed to take an idea to fruition. So next up, number 4 and number 3 are actually 2 podcasts that I lump together because they're often produced by the same people. And this is both from NPR, and one is called Planet Money, and the other one is called Indicator. So while the previous podcast, Startup, was all about entrepreneurship and how to take an idea and make it reality, Planet Money and The Indicator are both about how economics interacts with daily aspects of our day-to-day life. Planet Money tends to be around 20 to 25 minutes, and they go a lot more in depth about economic concepts. So for example, one of my favorite Planet Money episodes was about vodka proof and how cheap vodka and expensive vodka are nearly indistinguishable if you take a taste test. But one of the reasons we're willing to pay a lot more for branded vodka is purely for the brand. Similarly, the podcast Indicator is just like Planet Money, but it's a bit shorter, and it usually focuses on one number every day, which they deem the indicator of the day. And they usually go over, again, very fundamental economic concepts. One of my favorite podcast episodes of The Indicator was about the soaring car prices. And this kind of went into detail about how in 2020, despite the fact that millions of people lost their jobs, despite the fact that we potentially almost had a recession, despite the fact that we almost had an inverted yield curve, the price of used cars actually increased. And they talked about why that was the case. And I love that because they do basically that sort of episode almost every day, and they're short episodes, very easy to understand, and it really shows you just how crazy and impressive economics is and how a foundational understanding can really change your world. So again, I'm going to link this presentation in the description below so you can actually visit these podcasts. All right, and now for my second favorite podcast. This is actually called How I Built This. It is a very famous podcast from a very famous host called Guy Raz. He interviews very famous entrepreneurs, such as, I think he interviewed the co-founders of Instagram, Kevin Systrom. He also interviewed Stacy's Pita Chips, the woman who made Stacy's Pita Chips. He interviewed Joe Gebbia of Airbnb. He interviews very famous entrepreneurs and talks about the story behind their, business. It tells you just how crazy it was that Airbnb was started by 2 guys who tried to rent out basically their San Francisco apartment during this massive political convention. And you really get to see the stories behind these massive movements that were built. And it's really, really, really fun. And so unlike Startup, which was another entrepreneurship podcast I had mentioned, Startup was 8 or 9 episodes about how someone takes one idea and brings it to life. So it's much more in depth. But How I Built This takes a more superficial view because it invites a lot more people, and every episode is focused on someone different. So, for example, one episode might be Instagram, another episode might be Stacy's Pita Chips, another episode might be Airbnb. But the good part is you can really pick up on some holistic themes across each episode that teach you a lot. My personal favorite episodes are included here. The reason I love Stacy's Pita Chips is because at the end of the How I Built This episode, they usually feature small-scale entrepreneurs, and I was actually featured on How I Built This because I made an organic chemistry board game. And that was at the end of the Stacy's Pita Chip episodes, and I just cannot get over that because I've been such a huge fan of this show. So to see my name in this was insane. So for anyone interested in entrepreneurship, this one is a must listen. I listen to it every Monday. It's one of my favorites. Definitely check it out, and I cannot say enough good things about it. And last but not least, the number one best podcast is Work Life. Work Life is so great because it combines the foundational principles of organizational psychology with productivity to show you how you can increase your impact in the workplace. This is actually hosted by a very, very famous psychologist, Adam Grant. He does a lot of impressive stuff, and he basically studies how to make work not suck, as he describes on the podcast. I've gotten so much out of this podcast. I've gotten more out of this podcast than all of the other podcasts, and that's why this is my number one favorite podcast. And the reason for this is, again, he's a scientist, so he really goes over a lot of empirical data and tells you just how to overcome these basic things that we all feel in our day-to-day lives. For example, one of his episodes is about burnout and just how bad burnout is and how we can combat it. Another episode he did was about loneliness and how to combat loneliness in the workplace. And one of the other favorite ones I really liked was becoming friends with your rivals. This is almost this aspect of co-opetition where you want to compete, but you also want to cooperate because sometimes it's better to increase the size of the pie rather than just try to get the biggest chunk of the pie. So all of these episodes, very useful. I definitely recommend you check out all of the podcasts I talked about here today. So starting with Startup, Planet Money, and The Indicator, How I Built This, and then, of course, Work Life. I think you will get a lot out of them. If you enjoyed this video, like, comment, share, and subscribe. I genuinely love talking about this stuff, so let me know if you guys have any feedback, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.